Hello and welcome to episode 61 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we will be kind of getting back into things after an unexpectedly long break. But we're back, and we're here to talk about some major one stuff because we didn't do a preview show or cover the event since it's happened. But we will also be discussing some of the roster news that has happened post Major 1 as we draw closer to the beginning of the Major 2 qualifying matches. But before we do any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Just to explain the unexplained absence for a little bit. I got COVID without actually getting COVID, but basically had COVID. And unlike people who get COVID and have a fever and stuff, then my worst symptoms was a sore throat and not really being able to talk, which isn't really productive for a podcast. So it was unfortunate timing. Then we had the holidays and stuff. So apologize for that delay if you guys were looking for content around the first major. But barring anything else unexpected happening health-wise coming up soon, we should be back in the swing of things for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I'm glad you're feeling better. I was sick last year around the holidays and it sucked. So I'm glad that, it's not that important to do a podcast, especially when you're having pretty severe symptoms from not COVID, but essentially COVID. So I'm glad you're feeling better, man.
Dodged it for 3 years. Couldn't make it longer though.
You gotta dodge like me and not go outside or talk to anybody except your girlfriend.
I mean that's what my mom brought it home, so I didn't even leave the house and it just got me.
Yeah, that's a bad teammate. That's a gym-like move to bring in COVID. Let's get into this episode. So first of all, let's talk about the major. Like I said, we didn't do a preview show. That was right when Bink got sick, and we just kind of been out of commission since then. But the very first major of the 2023 Call of Duty League season did happen before the holiday break. It happened in Raleigh, North Carolina, and this is the only Pro-Am style tournament of the season. So this was a $500,000 tournament, which invited all 12 of the Call of Duty League teams and then the top 8 challengers teams. So a few teams from North America, from Europe, and then one from APAC and one from Latin America. I'll bring up the bracket here on the screen in just a second. But give me your, I don't know how you want to go over this without, completely detailing it like we usually do on our post-major shows. But kind of what are your biggest takeaways or what stood out to you in this first major of the CDL season?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it as short and sweet as possible. First, most importantly, since we didn't do a preview show or a recap show of the second week of qualifiers for the Major 1 qualifiers. Most notably with those matches, we don't have to talk about them, but the biggest thing of note was that the M4 was GA'd, which got us to our current meta right now of the TAC/the SCAR assault rifle and the VazDev submachine gun. That obviously paid dividends for certain teams and affected other teams that played better with the M4 during the first week of qualifiers, but that is definitely worth noting. And I will say, as someone who likes to play a little more OBJ-minded or aggressive with a submachine gun myself, I think this current meta is more beneficial to the subs just because, the SCAR is that better gun at long range. Sub will do the job close range, and then that medium range is where, some mixy stuff can happen, as opposed to when we had the M4 just being a do-it-all weapon. Almost had 4 M4s on the maps at some times. So it was kind of a breath of fresh air in my eyes throughout the qualifiers and the major in particular to see that weapon meta shift, and barring any unexpected GAs that I haven't heard anything about, that should be the meta heading into this week's qualifiers as well. But speaking of the major itself, even before we get to this bracket, that if you're watching the video version on screen, I even forgot about it myself, that this was technically a Pro-Am, which means there was the groups before we got into the actual winners bracket. And just right away, none of the, or actually did Elevate make it out? No, they didn't. So
No, none of them
none
did.
of the Pro-Am teams made it into the winners bracket. Elevate, which was, I believe that was Gizmo's team. How do I look for that roster? Elevate, Denza, Gizmo, Harry, and Vortex. So some guys who were on London. Vortex has been around. I remember him from the Epsilon, infamous Epsilon days. Um, Elevate made some noise, causing some upsets, and so did LAG Academy, but they weren't able to go beyond the group stage of the event. And most notably, Boston, um, Boston, London, and OpTic were eliminated before uh, the bracket play stage, as well as LAG. So that's OpTic, LAG, Boston, and London, where they were the CDL teams that didn't make it into the top 8. Boston kind of had a little bit of an unfortunate situation with Awakening getting sick that led to Beans' debut in their second match. So not, obviously Boston didn't get the results that they were probably expecting just because they played well in the first week of qualifiers with the M4. I don't remember exactly what they did in the second week of qualifiers, but they didn't get their desired result at the major. Same thing kind of with London. We were talking about last time we did a show before the qualifiers how London was looking really strong in S&D, especially during that first week of qualifiers. Then things didn't go their way at the major as well. But the big shock for most people probably was OpTic getting that top 12 finish. They ended up, I know they lost to Florida, but I'll just look at their group. Yeah, so they beat Florida 3-2 in the first round, got swept by Toronto in the qualifying match in the winner's side, and then lost 3-2 to Florida in their qualifying match in the loser's side. So disappointing performance out of OpTic to, any fan standards, but especially the Green Wall, which inevitably leads to some roster stuff we'll get into here in a little bit. But I just know off the top of my head, without going into depth, they had a couple S&D leads that they threw away. That's the most notable thing I remember just off the top of my head. But, regardless of circumstances around the actual losses, just a top 12 finish for the Green Wall is going to sting more than usual. And, considering Scump's final year, possibly the longest break we have or just had between majors this season, it meant, the OpTic was going to try to be proactive and make a change when they could. So that's the group talk stuff. And then the biggest thing from the major, you just got to give props to subliners. New York absolutely fried all weekend at this event. Had a little bit of a hiccup in the winners bracket against Seattle. There was a controversial situation on a CLO control. Unlike the previously discussed SAE bug, there was like some controller issue or something with Hydra that led to Seattle sneaking away with that control win and then eventually taking that series. But New York was able to make the run through the losers bracket, get a rematch against the Surge, and then just, dominated from there to win the series. I believe Kismet took home MVP honors. All 4 players on New York really just fried. I remember there was one point during the event they showed the top 10 KDs, and just all 4 of New York's players are in the top 10. Even for a guy like Kismet, who more OBJ dirty work minded, that's pretty impressive. So, pretty good run out of them. Seattle getting second. We've talked about Seattle at length with especially this roster that's been together for more than a year now. They have that potential to be in championships on a consistent basis, and they showed it here again at this event. FaZe getting third might be, a little bit of a disappointment to, FaZe fans who expect that dynasty, but when their losses are to the first and second place teams, I don't think you can take, be too hard on yourselves if you're in the Atlanta camp there. And then Toronto looked good with Scrappy, had some highlight reel moments. Standy too, I remember. But you had the Thieves kind of disappointing following up their back-to-back chips to end the Vanguard season. A lot more stuff we can talk about, and I'll throw it out quick too that Vegas once again looked pretty solid. I just know we talked about in qualifiers that Vegas had some moments where they looked good, but they weren't getting the wins, but the matches were closer than you might have expected for a Vegas/Paris team in the past. Vegas getting I believe, top 6 at this tournament. Yeah,
Yeah,
getting top
top
6.
six.
That's definitely a good start for the Vegas rebrand, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
So
was I was concerned you were gonna forget about the Legion because uh I mean in a tournament where a team like OpTic and the Gorillas, who had these like long-term players under contract, for the Legion to outplace them, and not just outplace them but get into the bracket and win a round in the bracket, is pretty incredible considering how bad they have obviously been. Not specifically this roster, but the team as a whole has been since pretty much the first season. Obviously big props to the Legion for beating the Rocker and getting that top 6 finish. And I'm sure that's, kind of a moral victory in a sense, because it's not anywhere close to winning a championship or being a real competitor, but it's a big step up from what the Legion fans have been accustomed to over the past several years. And I did also want to mention that the Nikki D curse is dead, I believe. It must have stayed in Seattle. He left it behind. He forgot it when he moved to Atlanta. Because it didn't work out for them. It was a good series, went to game 5, but Seattle was still able to beat FaZe, which obviously has to be a little bit concerning for Atlanta fans, considering this is kind of a trend now, like over basically an entire season, and now we're into essentially the fourth or fifth of the season this year, and Seattle has almost always gotten the better of FaZe, and I'm not entirely sure why. And I mean, we'll get into some of these roster changes or these rumored changes that seemingly fell through, but the fact that Seattle was kind of possibly thinking of changing their roster, especially in such a big way after beating FaZe and getting to the grand final of a major, really baffles me. But I don't want to just keep talking about it. But the subliners for sure, that really surprised me. I mean, I don't think most of us were expecting the subliners to come out and be the best team, and especially come from the losers bracket and win 3 straight matches to get to the grand final. Just an incredible run, and something that Crim6 is probably going to be punching the air for, because that's incredible. But definitely big props to them.
yeah, and I think the biggest thing, obviously, with our hiatus is we didn't really get to talk about that second week in the transition
Mm-hmm.
from the M4 to the Scar meta that we kind of mentioned. But I'm looking back here at my notes. I am pretty sure New York went 0-2 in the first week of the qualifiers. I could go back one more to look, but I'm on the second week. In the second week of matches, they 3-0 to LAG, and then they beat Boston 3-2. I believe that was their. Yeah, so they went 2-0
Mm-hmm.
in the qualifiers leading up to this, as opposed to they lost 3-0 to London in the first week,
And 3-1
and
to Toronto.
then yeah, why don't I see that? Oh, it's the last match. Yeah. So 0-2 to 2-0 to major championship. Might seem a little weird just because we didn't have that little nugget to talk about in the middle, but yeah, I think obviously if you watch the first week of the qualifiers, you definitely weren't expecting this, but they're got to be the team to beat in most people's eyes right now.
Yeah, for sure. Even Seattle, like their run to the major grand final is pretty weird. Obviously, I mean, week 1 they go 0-2, just like the New York Subliners. They lose to LAG in Boston. Then they beat London in week 2, who had swept the Subliners in week 1, and then they lose to Toronto. And then in the major, they even lost to, or I'm looking at, no, or whatever. I was looking at the groups, but they lost a phase in the groups, and then they avenged that loss in the bracket. And of course, they did beat the Subliners and then lost to the Subliners. But just a lot of props to subliners and the surge, particularly for bouncing back from kind of unfavorable online conditions, especially with the meta change, really like between the 2 weeks, and then not a lot of practice to get used to everything. So kind of an unusual tournament, especially with the format. We had these pro-am teams, or these challengers teams, coming up and playing these pro teams. But I think overall it was a fun experience. I think more tournaments should be like this, where we incorporate the challengers teams, the top challengers teams, because I think it gives those teams something to play for, other than just a prize pool, in the pit. Like, they actually get a chance to prove themselves. And of course, there weren't any of these challengers teams that made it into the 8-team bracket, but some were close. And this was definitely a big tournament for the LAG Academy roster, because it allowed them to prove that they were actually good enough to be on a CDL roster. You want to get to that, or do you have any other lasting thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I was going to use Pred as a jumping board, but you can go ahead with that. I was just going to say, obviously with the meta change, an explosive SMG like Pred is probably going to be see more benefits from, not having to deal with 4 M4s as opposed to being able to have that strong Vaznev in his hands. But yeah, there's, a lot of fallout from the results of this major that, going to jump right into now.
Yeah, so let's start with LAG, just for convenience. But the Gorillas, they finished top 12, just like OpTic, and their academy team also finished top 12 at the major. So the top 12 placings at the tournament were LAG Academy, OpTic Texas, and Elevate. So LAG's roster for the tournament was Hook, Neptune, Spart, and Arcides. And we talked about it before the season started, that Spart and Arcides had signed, I believe they were 3-year deals. That's correct, right? So they signed the longest extension possible with LAG before the season. Neptune and Hook had obviously also been on the roster last season, but it was a pretty disastrous season for LAG, who failed to make champs even after winning Major 2 and getting all of the points that come with it. So LAG, they go into this tournament and they don't play well. And LAG Academy, whose roster was Exceed, Assault, Diamond Con, and Joe Deceives, they also finish top 12. And that, I think, that's a real eye-opener. When your academy team, or your B team essentially, they can play on par with your CDL team. And I'm assuming they play a lot cheaper as well, considering the contracts that they probably had to give to someone like Hook, and obviously Arcides is staying on the roster. But LAG Academy, this is how their first major went. The qualifiers, they beat D1 Gaming and Rocker Academy. They lost in a Game 5 series to Atlanta FaZe. They beat London, and then they lost to Seattle Surge, who obviously went on to go to the grand finals. And they also won the open bracket of the Challengers tournament. So they beat Elevate twice and Rocker Academy. And LAG, after this tournament, they decide, okay, like, if we have the same performance from a CDL team that undoubtedly costs much more than this academy team that placed the exact same, why not go with the academy team? And that has pretty much launched these changes. So Hook has since departed for OpTic, and Neptune and Spart have been moved to the bench, making room for Assault, Exceed, and Joe Deceives to make their way onto the roster, which, kind of sucks for Diamond Con for him to get left out in all of this, but it's kind of just how it goes. What are your thoughts on this move from LAG to bring up 3/4 of their academy roster?
Yeah, I think first it's important to preface that one, and I know you're mentioning money here, but this isn't Paris. This is, an
Yeah.
organization backed by the Cronkies, so it's a little bit different. I don't think money played a major factor in these decisions. And secondly, it's also important to note that LAG Academy was one of, if not the best academy teams heading into this tournament. Even beforehand, they won if they won both cups, or I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure they won the most recent cup heading into the major, or maybe they won one, at least that I remember. Maybe it was the first one, not entirely sure, but arguably they were one of the best academy teams at the time. So, especially in a league without expansion that's, only has 12 teams, essentially being like, if you got the bottom CDL team, and then the top challengers team is right above them, having the 12th and 13th teams, and not much of a separation there outside of actually having a franchise slot. So I'm excited to see Joe Deceives in the CDL. He's a rookie, seemingly coming out of nowhere. I don't know his full background. I would love to talk to him at some point to get that information, but I'm pretty sure I've seen stuff like on Twitter that he got noticed through ranked play, which is an entire other discussion we can have at another time about the importance of ranked play and how it's still very questionable that it's not even in the game yet. But aside from that, I'm excited to see him. And you both got Exceed and Assault getting another chance in the CDL. Assault being a former world champion and world champion MVP at the 2018 COD Champs. Exceed getting a brief stint with the Minnesota Rocker during MW 2019. They're both in there. And to be playing against the, prize pool wise most successful Call of Duty professional of all time in Arcides, should have some potential to try and turn around LAG season. I will say it's a little interesting just on paper to think about Assault and Arcides on the same team, just because in the past you would more traditionally think of them both as main AR players. But just due to the nature of the SCAR, I could see it working. There might be some issues on different maps if the meta changes, whatnot. But for now, I don't think it's a huge issue. It's just something to keep in mind heading into the debut of this lineup. But my eyes are definitely on Joe Deceives to see how he is able to compete with these top dogs now that he's getting an actual shot in the pro league, despite having a little bit of a teaser or appetizer at the pro-am. Now he's officially that 18-year-old in the CDL, and we'll get to see what he does on a regular basis.
I love that. I don't love that any team or any players get dropped or get benched or whatnot, because it sucks for those guys, especially since we are just through the first major. There have only been a handful of online matches, and they've only had a handful of LAN matches now, and they're being judged fairly or unfairly against that. And I'm sure that, or I hope that Spart and Neptune will get another chance to kind of prove themselves that they're worthy of a CDL spot. We'll see if it happens. But I am also very happy to see Challengers players get this opportunity to make an impact and not be put in a position kind of like Paris was in last year, where there's no chance that they're even going to get to the playoffs. They don't really have a chance to make a run at all. But one Challengers player could come in late in the season and get their chance, which isn't really much of a chance. Whereas this is a true chance. Like, LAG obviously had a poor first major, but it's only the first major. And now Joe Deceives, Assault, and Exceed get to actually prove whether they are deserving of a CDL spot with the Gorillas. I'm just very happy. I think that we need to see more success stories in Challengers, especially mid-season. I think there's a lot to be made about the guys like Pred. It's like, oh man, this kid's really good. Or in the past, we've seen it with someone like Simp, who they were just waiting for him to turn 18 so they could officially add him to their CWL roster. But these players like Exceed, who have been around for several years and kind of got their shot, but did they really? And Assault, who is, I would say, on the back end of his career, the back half of his career. I don't want to, cast aspersions or anything, but he was also at his peak 5 years ago or 4.5 years ago, which feels like a lifetime ago. And it really was in Call of Duty sense, because look at the players that he was playing with when EG won the World Championship. Aches has been retired for a while now. Silly has been in Challengers for a while now. Apathy has been retired, and he looks like an old man because he's got so many gray hairs and he's got a kid. He's like a full-grown adult. And then Bevels has been around pretty much forever now because of that EG team, and he was a coach in the CDL. So like, to think that he's getting another shot, which usually doesn't happen unless you're like a big time name, like a big time player. It usually doesn't happen that you get another shot at the top level, and I'm glad that we're here and that LAG has done this to kind of refresh their roster. Whether it works or not, I don't know. It's kind of hard to predict any CDL roster performance, especially when OpTic of all teams is going out with a top 12 finish. But yeah, I'm just very excited to see what this roster can do, if anything.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing we can kind of set the stage for one of the other teams we're going to be talking about here is that there were rumors of potentially Arcities going to OpTic in all this. I think he himself actually tweeted something like referencing to his contract. I didn't just look it up. Oh, here it is. He tweeted, this was in response to a random fan on Twitter. It says, the fan goes, "I take it Scump and the boys are ready to scrim." This was on December 24th, I believe. This is when Chrome posted on CDL Intel. RC's replies, "I mean, I love to play with the red duo. It's just not a realistic thing. It wasn't me. I'm going to be real. It might get me in trouble, but I wanted it. Obviously, those three are godlike, just not how things work with contracts. I owe LAG the same faith and trust they have in me to build something special with them. I'm sorry for dreams being killed." So that just makes reference again to the long-term deal he signed with LAG this past offseason, likely having a very large buyout attached to it, which in the end seemingly prevented him from making a move to OpTic. Obviously, we don't know how close any potential move was, but that was heavily rumored during this past little holiday / post Major 1 break.
Yeah, one note before we move on and we talk about OpTic and Pred and all of that. This is just kind of like the nature of the beast when it comes to contracts. 5-6 years ago, Arcities would have been on OpTic, right? Or Pred would have been on OpTic, because there were no contracts, or like the idea of contracts were so kind of flimsy that these players could essentially move without any restrictions whatsoever. But now that Arcities has signed a 3-year deal, 3 years is a long time. I was just talking about that it was like 4 years ago that Assault was on top of Call of Duty. And now he's been out of the league for several years, and now he's getting his chance. 3 years is a really, really long time in COD, and that's a big commitment for RCs. That's a big commitment for LAG if they do decide to stick with him that entire time. And I think it's a pretty mature way to look at it. RCs is like, I wanted it, but I also have to be realistic and say I committed and LAG committed back, and now we are in this together, whether I wanted to take this incredible opportunity or not. And it would be an incredible opportunity to play alongside Scump in the final season of his Call of Duty career, and to obviously play for OpTic because he was a Chicago Huntsman, and OpTic is by far the biggest team in the CDL. So it's a very realistic and I think a mature way to look at it from RC's point of view. Let's talk about the OpTic / Pred stuff now, because or let's talk about the real roster change that did happen. So Dashy has been benched by OpTic, and in his place, Hook will be coming to OpTic to play alongside his former Dallas Empire trio, or duo, making it a trio, Shotzi and Illy, who they won a world championship together in 2020? The first 2019? It was the first
2020, but yeah, it's MW 2019, 2020.
Yeah, so CDL champs 2020, the Dallas Empire winning the world championship. Hook was a part of that roster. And then they had a really messy breakup. I believe it was in April 21. And, some things were definitely said. I don't know who they were actually directed at because Hook didn't actually say, but he said that people were talking behind his back and things kind of dissolved, and he ended up making his way to the Los Angeles Thieves, and then he eventually went to the Los Angeles Gorillas. But he is now back in Texas. He will be taking Dashy's spot. Just on Hook's arrival and Dashy's benching, what do you think about that, and how do you see that going for OpTic?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. Most notably, in my eyes, the biggest thing that people are going to be looking at is when you're replacing Dashy with someone like Hook, who's known for being an SMG, that now seemingly moves Illy into the main assault rifle role, unless Scump just decides to completely shift gears and become a main AR overnight. Seemingly puts Illy in that position to be a main AR, which is something we haven't really seen from him. Obviously, we've seen him use an AR, but it hasn't really been in that quote unquote main role that people like to, slot people into position wise. So, not only that, but we'll seemingly also see Scump go to the flex, um, which, there isn't really a flex gun in this game in the current meta, but we'll just seemingly be seeing more of an AR in Scump's hands if we have Shotzi and Hook running around with subs. Will certainly be some maps where they could run 3 subs with Hook, Shotzi, and Scump, and you could even make the argument that that would be could potentially be one of their strong suits if they're, some of these smaller maps, they could just cause chaos with 3 subs. You got 3 of the best sub players in Call of Duty history. You definitely make the case for it. So that could be a strong suit for this team, but again, we'll have to wait and see until we actually get a taste for what this roster is capable of when qualifiers kick off here this weekend.
Yeah, I'm interested in just like the idea of this roster because I don't think Hook has been especially impressive over the past few seasons, essentially since he left Dallas. He's of course had a hard time sticking around teams with the Thieves. That was a debacle in of itself, trying to like coming into the roster, and then he was benched, and then apparently he didn't sign his name correctly, and then he got benched again, and then he made to the Gorillas, and they didn't do anything except win that major, and then kind of fall off a cliff in the back half of the season. I just, I'm interested to see if this could help Hook get back to where he was, because I thought he was an incredible player in 2020. So Modern Warfare 2019, he was a great piece for that Dallas Empire team, and definitely a big reason why they ended up winning the world championship. But that's been a few years now, and who knows what kind of situation he's entering with this OpTic team, because obviously there's a lot of pressure on them, right? That Scump is retiring this season, and they just had a horrible placing, definitely the biggest disappointment of the first major. And who knows what kind of internal issues they still have to work through, because if memory serves, they did not just drop Dashy for a day in the offseason. They also dropped Illy for a day. And I mean, that's I bring that up because I said it in the offseason. Let's see what happens when they have adversity in the season. When they get to a point where they're like, damn, this is hard. How do we get through this? How do they react? Because they've had these issues, and obviously they played out in public to publicly drop a player or 2 players in the offseason and say, like, we're done, we're moving on, and then 24 hours say, nope, never mind, we're all good. And then to get to a point after the first major of the season where you're dropping one of those players again, I mean, I think there's a lot to work through, or I would assume there is a lot to work through for this OpTic team, but maybe Hook is the right person to help them work through it and get them through this rough stretch. But if things don't go well in, say, the first, the second major, or the second set of qualifying matches, what happens then? Do you make another roster change? Does Illy go out of the roster? Does Hook get benched? What happens? Do you bring Dashy back because you're like, we're paying you a lot of money and we think you can be a big part of our roster? Do they try to get Pred again? Like, there's so many things that could happen if this team doesn't, I don't even know if expectations is the right word, because OpTic fans have notoriously high expectations for their team, but I don't think the expectations for this specific roster is as high. It's probably the lowest it's been in a while for an OpTic team, because Hook hasn't been at the top form that he's been in the past, and this team has looked pretty disappointing in just like a month ago. So I'm not sure exactly what to expect of this roster, but I'm gonna be pretty excited to watch them, because the reaction to them from the community will probably be pretty incredible, to be honest.
Yeah, I think Hook's talent is undisputable,
Yeah.
regardless of what form he currently is. I even remember in Cold War when LAT just briefly had Hook, how Nate Shot tweeted, like, is one of the best FPS players to ever touch FPS games, and if you have a chance to get a talent like that, you take that chance. So in theory, that's what we could be seeing here is, there were the rumors of Arcities to OpTic, Pred to OpTic, which we haven't really talked about, but that would have just been absolutely nuts and caused massive ripples throughout the rest of the CDL too. But with LAG parting ways with Hook, this makes it a very easy change that didn't have a lot of other dominoes fall as a result. It's just, it's going to come down to, obviously Dashy was extremely talented as well. A little bit of a role change here, and we'll just have to wait and see how things shake out when they actually get into matches.
Before we move on from OpTic, let's talk about Pred for a second, because this was definitely the biggest story that dominated the COD scene over the past week or two. The rumor of Pred going to OpTic to replace Dashy was pretty attractive for everybody on the OpTic side of the fence. Of course, he's one of the best Call of Duty players in the world. He was one of the best Call of Duty players in the world last season as well, in his rookie year. And there is a lot to, he has such a bright future. He's so young, and it's pretty obvious why you would want a player like Pred on your roster. For me, though, it came down to, like, I don't need to kind of say why OpTic needs it, but I need to wrap my head around why Seattle, of all teams, would make that move. And the answer is money. Like, that's the only answer that would ever make sense. Or like, Pred is an awful teammate to be around. Like, those would be the only two answers that you could have that would make it make sense for Seattle to ever think about parting ways with Pred. And they apparently almost did it. Pred said in a stream that, quote, "Let's just leave it at everything that could have possibly happened to make it happen was attempted. Let's just say everything that was possible to make it happen was attempted. It was attempted to the highest level. It just wasn't possible. Done everything we could. It just wasn't possible." That is a man that really wanted to wear an OpTic jersey on main stage. That is not someone that's like, well, it didn't happen, so who cares? That sounded like someone who really wanted to be on OpTic. And like we said with RCDs, it makes sense why you would want to be on OpTic. But at the same time, it's you have to make a commitment, right? Like, OpTic committed to Dashy and they decided to move on. They decided to bench him and find a replacement. But Seattle had made a commitment to Pred when Pred, I don't believe, was a highly sought after Challengers player before last season. They committed to him. He committed to them. And that's just kind of how it goes. And Seattle is in such a good place. They are a championship contender. It makes no sense for them to part ways with Pred until they know that they cannot win a championship. I said it on Twitter, and people were like, well, shouldn't they take it if they're getting however many hundreds of thousands of dollars and he's going to walk for free in the offseason? And my answer is absolutely not. If they can win a championship, if they at any point before they have to lock in their roster, if at any point they say we cannot win a championship with Pred on our roster, then that is the time that they make that move. They decide to send him to OpTic or whatever team. But until that happens, he should be a part of the Seattle Surge roster because he could walk for free. He could sign a big money contract with OpTic in the offseason. But if they win champs, it's all good. They decide they made the perfect play. If he walks away, it's like Kawhi Leonard when he played for the Toronto Raptors. He played one season. They knew he was probably not going to re-sign with the Toronto Raptors, and they decided to go ahead with it anyway. They did not trade him because they knew we can win a championship with him, or they thought they could win a championship, and they did. And he walked away. And you know what Toronto Raptors fans say about Kawhi Leonard? He is the greatest player that they've seen, probably other than Vince Carter. It's ridiculous not to keep Pred on your roster, and I'm very glad that Seattle did it. But OpTic was apparently pretty close. So let me get your thoughts on it. Enough of me talking. What do you think about the Pred almost going to OpTic rumors?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously two ways, kind of you hinted at it, that you can look at this from. You can look at it from the perspective of Seattle wanting the money or wanting to win. Regardless of what side of the fence you're on, I think it's there's value in both scenarios. But just to start, the one thing I feel like everybody has to remember is Seattle was arguably right up there with Paris before last year as one of the worst organizations in the CDL, just from a results standpoint. They had a huge money, very expensive veteran roster in MW 2019 that didn't meet expectations. They struggled in the Cold War season 2. Then they go into this complete roster revamp, and they bring in accuracy and Mac, who Mac himself, despite what some people may consider him to be a veteran, I still don't. But
You have to
the
get over
big
that.
moves, I have to, but I never will. The two moves to accompany Mac inaccuracies were bringing in rookies, Pred and Sib. And obviously that just completely changed the entire dynamic of Seattle as a franchise, allowing them to get a championship last year. But at the same time, since they were on those rookie deals, at least as far as we know, I believe they signed 1+1 extensions for this year. So that does put them in a position to potentially just have both Sib and Pred walk away in this following offseason, which is a scary proposition for Seattle fans, just because, like you were saying, they completely flipped the script for Seattle as a franchise. So they can cross that road when they get there, but I think you're right. If obviously they get second place at Major 1. We saw them have success last year with this very same roster, which is one of the reasons they stuck with this roster heading into 2023. So Seattle obviously has that potential, and that's one way to look at it. But I think the writing is on the wall unless Seattle is somehow able to offer a very lucrative contract that other organizations aren't able to match. Pred might be one of the highest paid players in the offseason, or in this following offseason, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him on OpTic. I mean, just logistically speaking, it's Scump retiring one of the best SMG players of all time, and you got one of the best young SMG players potentially waiting in the wings to replace him. So could be a match made in heaven, but we'll cross that road when we get there. I do think it's interesting just on the overall topic of OpTic as well, as I don't know when this dropped. It might have happened during our break, but I'm pretty sure there was some OpTic content video or something like that where Scump kind of mentioned that nobody knew in the offseason that Shotzi basically said, like, if Scump retired, he was going to leave OpTic. But if Scump stayed, Shotzi was going to stay. And that kind of was surprising to me, just because you think of OpTic in its current state, heading in the next year with Scump most likely retiring, you feel like it's basically Shotzi's team from that point forward, and he has the keys to the castle. But if he was considering leaving last year, that could completely change the entire offseason dynamic if he decides to walk away from OpTic this following year. So a whole lot of implications with this. It's certainly, I think the only thing we didn't actually mention about the Pred thing was Crone doing not a report, but just basically revealing in a tweet that Seattle declined what would have been the largest deal in Call of Duty League history. I think he means buyout wise, which, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been the Hook deal, which was said before to be the largest buyout. I don't really know, obviously, don't have the sources like that, but there have been some pretty large buyouts. I know even there was the talks of when Shotzi was acquired from Splice slash Toronto heading into the first year by the Dallas Empire. That was supposedly an astronomical buyout. I don't remember the number, and I'm pretty sure Hook even offered, or he actually did pay part of it by reducing his salary, something along those lines. So we've seen some pretty crazy buyouts in Call of Duty history, and to have Seattle be in a position where they decline potentially the largest buyout for a guy like Pred just shows how good slash impactful a guy like Pred is. And like you kind of alluded to, they're, barring any major ramifications chemistry-wise that these rumors might have, which I don't think they will, because it seems like everything was like out in the open, at least from a Seattle standpoint here. I think we're going to see Seattle continue to be a strong team throughout this year, and most likely a major factor of that will be Pred.
Yeah, I definitely think that Seattle will be a contender as we get closer to champs, which is very far away. But I believe that they've kind of found their groove. They might make a roster change at some point, but making that move and pushing Pred out of the roster seems like probably the worst move that they could possibly make. And I'm very glad that it didn't come down to a money thing where they decided to go for the cash instead of competing. And it's refreshing because we've heard a lot, or not heard, but we've seen a lot of what Paris / Vegas have done over the past few years, where they put out these pretty lackluster rosters. They don't perform well at all. And then, they kind of just like, it seems like they're biding their time until this thing is profitable, which I don't know if it'll ever be profitable. So why bank on that at all? But especially Seattle, it's like, if you're so close to being like a top level team consistently, why throw it all away? Because OpTic isn't throwing it away. I'm sure that they're not profitable. They spend a ton of money on their players. Like, you don't think Scump costs a lot? You don't think Shotzi costs a lot? Dashy, Illy? That roster is stacked, and they paid a lot to stack it. And they just finished they finished a top 12. Seattle finished second. And people are trying to convince me that Seattle should make that move. No, they shouldn't. If OpTic can convince Seattle to make that move, they should do that, because then they have acquired one of the best players. But I'm very happy that it didn't happen, because that would have absolutely sucked for the league to have one of the brightest stars, one of the very best players end up on OpTic, when he could stay on this other team and potentially compete with OpTic throughout the entire year.
I will,
what do you say?
From a league standpoint, obviously, the league is at its highest when OpTic is seeing success, just from a viewership standpoint. And it's the most popular team with the most fans, so people like to see OpTic succeed. I forget exactly where I was going with that, but it was just, well, I agree with your point that you see in sports a team that just made it to the Super Bowl probably isn't trading away their star player to a low team unless it's a contract situation, or they're trying to get money, or that Super Bowl contender didn't have a great season and somehow just went on a miraculous run. It would essentially be like, let's just use last year as an example. If the Bengals traded away Joe Burrow to the Browns last offseason,
I would have been a really happy person last offseason.
You would have been happy, but it's a move that wouldn't have made sense because the Bengals were just in the Super Bowl. Browns coming off a lackluster season. I guess that's the closest comparison I can think of right off the top of my head. But it would have, obviously, if Pred did go to OpTic, it would have been a huge move that would have had a ton of hype surrounding it. Greenwald would have been going nuts every time he flexed on main stage at LAN events and stuff. But for the health of the league overall, I could see your point where having a team like Seattle be competitive is better than the, drastic outcome of potentially them getting rid of Pred and then being not as good as they were before, which, in theory is possibly what would have happened if they actually got rid of Pred just because of how talented Pred is.
Yeah. I think of it like, I really like the, traditional sports analogies because it kind of, that's just the easiest way to think about it. But the Dallas Cowboys are undoubtedly the most popular NFL team. The Dallas Cowboys have essentially not been a contender for like a decade or 2 decades, whatever. Like they haven't, since I've been born, they have not really been competitive for like a Super Bowl for the most part, except for like Tony Romo, like bobbling a field goal. That's about it. Like that was their last bit of like actual competitiveness. But sure, like Joe Burrow could have gotten traded to the Cowboys to really help the Cowboys' chances at a Super Bowl. But like, what is it in for the Bengals? Like, what do they really get? Like, they get like a high draft pick. Yeah, that's cool. That actually sucks. I take it from me. I've been a Browns fan my entire life. Got another decent draft pick this year. It's not fun. Not fun at all. The draft sucks. But to get to my real point, it's like, it is true that OpTic, when they are at their best, then viewership for the league and interest in the CDL is at its highest. But that's a concern for the CDL. That's a concern for Activision as a whole. That's not a concern for Seattle. Like Seattle should, and I think, this, like, but I think there are people in this community that think, well, why aren't other players like kind of helping OpTic? Because if OpTic is the biggest team, the most popular team, and the team that will help the league grow to new heights and get new people to watch, then why isn't the league and why aren't other players and teams helping them? Because they shouldn't need help. They are OpTic. Like to literally have one of the best players in the world on another team that is a championship contender that just finished 3rd at champs last season and 2nd in the first major of the season, to get him to be like, man, it really sucks that I didn't go and leave my team for another team that finished top 12. That is the OpTic power. They have so much strength to bring in everybody, and because everybody wants to play for OpTic, everybody wants to have the OpTic juice, and everybody wants to like get paid like an OpTic player. But like Seattle doesn't need to help them, neither does Florida or whoever. OpTic needs to help themselves. That's all there is. And it would have been a good move. I'm not saying that. Like OpTic, if they would have made that move, it would have been a great move. They would have been a heist. Like it doesn't matter how much money it is. It's all about like winning at the end of the day. And especially in Scump's last season, if they could go out with a championship, then you could pay $1 million. You could pay $1.5 million. It doesn't matter because that was worth it in the end.
You make a movie about that and make that money back.
Yeah, like they'll bring back Vision, and Hitch will be producing every week about Scump winning a championship. It'll be amazing, and everyone will watch. But Seattle, they're doing their own thing. They want to win a championship for them, and they don't want to kind of handicap themselves to allow OpTic to sneak into a championship.
Yep, as cool as OpTic Pred might be, and you can make the case that we might see OpTic Pred next year. Yeah, I think as cool as that is, it's just not the reality we're in, and barring anything crazy happening coming up soon, we should see Pred potentially competing in championship Sundays with Seattle for the rest of the season.
Yeah, let's get to another roster change before we hop into the predictions and whatnot. Paul X has been benched by the London Royal Ravens in place of Scraps. And this was, it's not that interesting in general just because London is not a great team. And it's kind of disappointing that Paul X has now been benched by another team, and this was just like we talked about with like Neptune and Spart. This is a pretty limited sample size that they're being judged on. But Paul X, what made it really interesting to me was that Paul X tweeted that he was going to be in the elite qualifier in challengers. And then there was kind of a back and forth between Paul X and Scraps, where Scraps basically was like, why are you leaking that I'm going to be on the roster? And Paul X was like, well, who cares? You know, like I love that bit about Call of Duty is like people on the players on Twitter are so much more open than like traditional sports. Like you're not going to see Andy Dalton like subtweeting like another quarterback for taking his spot on the depth chart. But in Call of Duty, that is something that happens. Let me get your thoughts on this move for London. This is the first time we've seen Scraps in a while in competitive. How do you think it goes?
Yeah, I think first off, I want to say Paul tweeted on January 5th that he's taking a step back from competing as a result of all this. He said he's still a substitute for London. They're supporting him in this, but seems like a mental health break or something along those lines. So wishing him the best. But just Scraps back in the CDL is good no matter what way you look at it. Really, he's arguably one of the most popular European players and one of the funniest players in general. His interviews are always comedy. So I think from that viewpoint, it's good to have Scraps back in. I'm pretty sure, I don't think I predicted Scraps for Paul X necessarily, but I think I predicted London to be the first to make a roster change just because it seemed like almost an inevitability that Scraps would find his way back in the league again. Being a European player on the European org now just seemed inevitable. But Scraps is a really good player. Obviously took a little bit of a break since we last saw him in the league, but should be exciting to see him back. And, after London's most recent performance, might be unfortunate, like you said, for Paul and small sample size, all that, but it seemed like something had to give, something had to change, and just turns out that's the move London decided to make. And we'll now get to see what Scraps is able to do competing once again. Obviously, was a strong player when he last competed in the league. Was on Paris, I believe, his last time in the league. So, this making a return to London from the first season of the CDL, and we'll just get to see if he's able to rebound from a little bit of a break and still has what it takes, which I'm sure he does.
Yeah, I'm excited to see Maddie back. He's one of the most entertaining people in COD. I hope that Weskin eventually returns as well because them together is ridiculous. I don't know what half of they're saying because they have the very thick Manchester accents, but they're very fun together. Scraps is a great player. Weskin's a great player. And I do think that London... I think the identity of London really is rooted in the fact that they have historically fielded almost all Europe or almost all English players, and to have another Englishman on the team is very great to see, especially since, like you mentioned, they are the only European org remaining now that Paris has moved to Vegas. And as for Paul X, like you said, I hope that his mental health break or his break, and we're presuming it's going to be a big mental health thing. I hope it goes well, and I hope that he gets kind of the rest he needs because, man, like it's got to be real stressful to grind COD all the time, especially with how bad Call of Duty is like half of the time, and how much crap that they have to deal with like how many games crash and like the practice and the scrims and the metas and the GAs, and then to go to a tournament and then not perform as well as you would like, and then to come back home and then be benched. I'm sure it's not great, and I just wish him the best, and I hope everybody is taking care of their mental health because that's obviously super, super important. Just like Bink needed a few weeks off from the podcast to deal with this non-COVID thing. If he was like, hey man, I'm just not feeling it, let's take a few weeks off, I'd be perfectly fine. And it sounds like I'm being facetious. I'm not, but it does sound like that. But I'm hope that Paul, he takes the step back that he needs and he comes back even stronger, because we've seen it with like Clayster. He's talked about it before, that he's real burnout, kind of like at his wit's end, and now he's back with the Legion. We've seen other players take mental health breaks before and come back and compete at a very high level. So it is definitely needed. It should be taken when needed. But yeah, this London roster now will have scraps on it, and that kind of concludes the RosterMania portion of the show. Not a ton of RosterMania stuff, just a lot of rumors and a lot of implications. Really, is kind of the big thing with Pred. The idea of Pred being on OpTic now is going to be at the forefront of every OpTic fan's mind probably for the next year or so, especially if Seattle falters and the idea of him coming to OpTic becomes closer to reality. But now that we've done the RosterMania stuff, let's get to the Major 2 qualifier stuff, because we went a while without doing predictions, but you can't get away from it any longer. We're going to do the first week, which is a little bit of a short week, but there's going to be another week of qualifiers in Major 2 than there were in Major 1, which only had 2 weeks of matches. So let's get through it. Friday, January 13th, I will be turning 25 years old that day. But the most important thing is obviously the 3 Call of Duty League matches that will be taking place on that day. The first of which, Toronto versus London. Who do you have?
Toronto.
I'm also going at the Ultra. Let's just see how Scraps does with London. And of course, this is online, so who knows exactly what will happen. But I will go Toronto as well. The Boston Breach versus the Minnesota Rocker. I'm going to go with the Boston Breach. I'm feeling them. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm going with I'm going with Minnesota, but I feel like Boston is a tough team to judge right now. Like we said, obviously an hour ago at this point. They had unfortunate circumstances with Awakening being sick at the major, and Awakening was arguably their best player during the week 1 qualifiers when they saw the most success. Obviously, that was an M4 meta versus the meta now, but you got to factor in that illness, and ideally, assuming he just wasn't able to play up to his best. So it's unclear how much of a impact that has. You would assume it has a major impact on a team like Boston, though. So we could see them bounce back. But I will take Minnesota in this one.
And the last match of my birthday, Vegas versus Seattle. Please, Vegas, give me a nice birthday gift, but I'm going with Seattle.
I'm going with Seattle too. I could see Vegas taking this one. Like I said, if there's some chemistry stuff going on with Seattle, Vegas could capitalize on that with the first match following the Pred rumors. But barring another inconsistent Seattle thing where they go on one of those streaks where they struggle a little bit, I think they should take this one.
Saturday, January 14th. Florida versus LAG. I'm going to go with Florida. LAG, this will be their first match with the LAG Academy trio joining Arcides. Who do you have?
I'm going to go with LAG. I think it's a good matchup for those guys coming in, especially Joe Deceives. It's not like he has to play Atlanta FaZe or now New York, the top dogs from the past major. Although Florida did play well at Major 1, better than expectations, I think this is a good opening matchup with potential for it to go either way, and I'll just go with LAG.
London versus Minnesota. I'm going to go with Rocker. Again, I don't know what Scraps will look like with London, but if London completely steamroll the Ultra on day 1, I probably would have a different pick, but I don't have that benefit right now.
Yeah, go Minnesota too.
Atlanta versus Seattle. I'm going to go with Seattle. Atlanta, who knows with the online stuff, but Seattle's had Atlanta's number most of the time, and I'm going to think that's going to keep happening.
Yeah, when I was typing the notes before the show, I, let out a little audible cue when I was just going through the matches here. This was the one that jumped off the page right away for obvious reasons that we've talked about. But despite past history, I will go with Atlanta here.
And the final match of Saturday, LA Thieves versus the New York Subliners. I think you have to go with New York after winning the first major. But, crazier things have happened.
Yeah, I'm going to go with New York here too, but this is definitely another good match. LAT will be looking to try to bounce back after a, quote unquote disappointing performance at Major 1 just compared to the back-to-back chips to end last year. So should be a good one here to end Saturday.
Sunday, January 15th, Toronto versus Florida. I think I got to go with the Ultra.
Me too.
OpTic versus Boston Breach. So Hook's OpTic debut. I'm going to go with the Breach. Maximum chaos. Especially if they get steamrolled in their first match together. But I do think that the Breach will come out on top.
I'm going to go with OpTic. I think, similar to the LAG versus Florida match, this is, again, another situation, obviously different circumstances because Hook isn't a rookie by any stretch of the imagination. But for a new roster, again, you don't have to play against a team like Atlanta or New York right off the rip. You're playing against Boston. No disrespect to those guys, but they're coming off their own struggles. So on paper, this is, a good matchup for new roster. So I'll take OpTic here.
And the final match of the weekend, a battle for Los Angeles, LAT versus LAG. I'm going to go with the Thieves.
Me too.
Yeah, you got to go with them, right? Because of the Gorillas' new roster. And even with their new roster, it's the world champions. You think that they might get it together after a somewhat disappointing Major 1.
The one thing I will say about this one too, though, is I'm pretty sure both of these teams are actually in facilities in LA. I know the LAG guys were moving out there, I'm pretty sure. And obviously the Thieves have that compound where the players play out of, I'm pretty sure. So although it's a quote unquote online match, if they're both in LA, that should be a good ping situation where we don't hear some of those online complaints we had last year where, like LAT was playing from LA against those East Coast teams and struggling with the online matches and stuff. So could be as close to the LAN scenario as possible for an online match with two teams in LA, but at the end, I still think the Thieves should take this one.
Yep, same. Since we didn't do any predictions for the first major, we just have the pick'em records from the qualifiers. So we are both 10-14, not a hot start for us. I mean, we're still heating up. We're second half players. This is all just preliminary stuff for us right now. We'll get it together when OpTic gets it together and they start winning and we start winning as well, right?
Sure, we'll go with that.
Sounds good. All right, that about does it. We'll be back hopefully next week unless Bink gets another life-threatening illness and he has to I shouldn't blame him all on that because I wasn't like too hot on doing the podcast either. Like when he's like, hey, I'm sick, and I was like, okay, like and then we just stopped talking for like basically 3 weeks. And I'm lazy. Like I have to be pushed to do things. So, but hopefully we will be back next week to recap the first week of the major qualifiers and talk about the second week of the major qualifiers. We'll definitely be discussing like how Hook looks on OpTic, how the new LAG roster looks, and how the new London roster looks now that Scraps is a part of it. But yeah, that's something to look forward to for next week. Make sure to subscribe or like the podcast on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2 Ks, at Pres Byers, and at Ego Chall Podcast. The next show should be January 17th, maybe. But I like doing them on Tuesdays because it's just easier on me to do them earlier in the week and get them done than wait till Thursday and then have to get it up early and stuff. So hopefully January 17th, but we will keep you updated, or we'll just pop up in your feeds if you make sure to follow us. But yeah, that about does it. Take it away, Bink.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Again, apologies for our little hiatus unexpectedly during major and the last week of the Major 1 qualifiers. But like you said earlier, should be back now for the long haul, and looking forward to giving you guys all the CDL content you can expect. So short and sweet. Thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.